Welcome, everyone, to another meeting of the Rethinking European Development and Security Speaker Series that is run with CDDRL and the Europe Center and Huber. We're delighted to welcome Grigore Pop-Eleches today, who is a professor of politics and international affairs at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and at the Department of Politics. He's an expert on political behavior and political economy, especially in the setting of post-communist systems, with articles that have appeared in some of the most important journals in political science. My personal favorite is his 210 piece on throwing out the bums, protest voting in unorthodox parties after communism, which explained why post-communist voters turned to the radical right and populist right parties. It was very prescient. He's also the author of two very important books, From Economic Crisis to Reform, and Communism's Shadow, Historical Legacies and Contemporary Political Attitudes. And today, he's presenting joint work on empathy and support for Ukraine at war. So please join me in welcoming Grigore.
Thank you. I should say that before jumping into the rest of it is that this is actually it's a very new project. We finished the data collection about 10 days ago, so it's a little rough around the edges, and just at the right time to be getting feedback, hopefully. And when we started this, we had been planning on doing this back in December. It took us a little while to navigate it to IRB and so on. And of course, unfortunately, this question of how we can continue to shore up support for Ukraine in its war against Russia has become even more important given the recent developments in the US and elsewhere. And so this question of how and why people can support Ukraine or don't, for that matter, obviously has implications for the sort of feasibility of continued international support. We've seen these kinds of questions in the US, in numerous European countries, they're facing similar types of dilemmas, because in the context of economic crisis, fiscal constraints, and so on, people ask, why should we be spending our money on Ukraine as opposed to other types of things? There's also an important danger of war fatigue, and then the types of either outright pro-Russian, pro-Putin, or sort of peacenik, neutral types of narratives from people like Orban and others, who sort of say, well, yes, of course, what Russia did was not great, but look, this war has been going on for way too long, and there's no way helping the Ukrainian government is not the solution, and so on. And then ultimately, and this is, I think, something we also have to acknowledge, is that a lot of the sort of mainstream parties in Europe that, while nominally steadfastly in favor of Ukraine, have not been very good at sort of justifying the reason for this, or at least have not been as effective in sort of getting this message out to people. And so the question then becomes sort of what drives this support, and how should we understand its feasibility going forward. And So one set of questions are sort of moral arguments, right? Of saying basically what Russia did is wrong. The way this war is conducted is wrong. We have a moral responsibility to help Ukraine, given the sort of nature of this whole situation, right? And moral arguments work to some extent, and then obviously in the sort of when the rubber hits the road, they have certain limitations. There's a second set of arguments which have to do with self-interest, right? The notion being, as this ad here shows, that was actually done by the Telegraph in the UK, says, if you have you heard of Riga, Tallinn, and Vilnius? If we abandon Kiev, you will, right? And I think certainly for people in the region, there is this sense of, if we do not help the Ukrainians, we are going to be next. And obviously these questions are more pressing for the Baltics, but other countries in the region, certainly Moldova, certainly Romania and Poland and so on, have similar types of fears. And so that may be another way of sort of thinking about why it may be worth spending money on helping Ukrainians. And then there's this question of empathy for the victims, right? We in the mass media we see these images of bombed cities, of civilians who were hurt, of all of these kinds of things. And so the question is whether this kind of empathy for the victims can make a difference, and if so, how, and how should we think about it? And so what we're trying to do a little bit in this project is to think about ways of promoting this kind of empathy, again, especially in the context of the type of fatigue after more than 3 years of war. And so there's this literature on perspective taking. So in social psychology, as a definition, is basically the notion of actively considering the outgroup members' mental states, right? So putting yourself, that's sort of the definition of empathy, is putting yourself in the shoes of somebody else. So it's not so much the sympathy of like, I feel bad for you, but it's like, what would it be like if I were in your situation, right? There's a bunch of experimental work, both in psychology and in political psychology, that shows that when people go through these kinds of exercises of trying to put themselves into the shoes of others, they tend to have greater tolerance towards outgroups. There have been applications, including to migrants and refugees, that again show that when you, in some cases, if you activate the sort of a person's family past of having been migrants, that they're more likely to empathize with sort of more recent migrants, and therefore, even though they may not necessarily like them that much, are sort of more willing to help than they otherwise would. And in general, there are two types of mechanisms that have been shown to matter in this context. One of them is cognitive. So this is this notion of having these associative links between yourself and the outgroup. So we know, if I'm Romanian, I can say, well, now it's the Ukrainians, but it could be us, and maybe it will be us, and therefore that's sort of one set of mechanisms. And the other one is purely affective, right? So it's this sort of empathic response of, I see somebody there suffering, and I feel, as a fellow human being, I feel bad for what they're going through, and therefore I may want to help them. But of course, like everything in the social sciences, there are uneven effects for these things, right? And one of them is that, so Todd has this article where he shows that when people identify strongly with the in-group, they're less likely to sort of have this empathic response when it comes to others. There's also a recent paper by Czarnisz et al. that shows that, at least in the Polish context, these kinds of experimental efforts to get people to empathize with migrants did not seem to work. We'll come back to the question of Poland and so on, but this is interesting because it's in a sense one of the closer sort of works to what we're doing. Now they're focusing specifically on migrants, and we're looking more at Ukrainians who are still in Ukraine, right? So there's a difference there, obviously, but the sort of idea is similar. And then there are some who even show that there can be backfiring if the group is disliked, right? So if I dislike somebody enough, then if you force me to try to think about them, maybe I dislike them even more, because I realize just how deeply I distrust them and so on, right? So building on this literature, we basically developed a set of hypotheses, and I should say this is, we pre-registered this study. I'll talk a little bit about some of the other hypotheses and so on afterwards. But for now, there's a very sort of straightforward, I mean, the main hypotheses are quite straightforward. And that is that for people who get this perspective-taking treatment, right, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in a second, they should have higher propensity to personally do things for Ukraine. And then we should expect them to have stronger support for the types of public policies having to do with either humanitarian aid or other types of aid, such as economic or military aid, in favor of Ukraine, right? So we should expect that if you are able to put yourself into the shoes of these people who are being victimized by this, that you should want to do stuff for them. So that's quite straightforward. In terms of the mechanism, sort of following the literature, we're going to look at these two sort of possible mechanisms. One of them being this sort of empathetic response, right? This identification with Ukrainians. And then the other one is this sort of cognitive measure, which sort of says, you know, it could be us next, right? And again, I'll talk a little bit more about how we measure this. But there is this notion of since we're doing this study in a bunch of countries that neighbor Ukraine and Russia, it's not crazy to think that this could happen, right? They don't have a big and beautiful ocean between them and Russia the way the US does. And then the other aspect where I think things are potentially a little bit more interesting is on this question of heterogeneous effects, right? And so one relatively obvious one is to think that if you're relatively well predisposed towards Ukrainians to begin with, then the act of putting yourself in your shoes should have a stronger effect. At the same time, we would expect weaker effects for people who identify more with Russia, for obvious reasons, and also potentially for people who identify more with their in-group, with their sort of own nation. Then there's I mean, for obvious reasons, again, there's sort of reasons to expect media to matter. And here we're looking specifically at Russian media, not because it's the only one that matters, but because in a cross-national context, figuring out exactly what type of domestic media covers what things in which way, it gets much trickier, and we don't have fine-grained enough information about that in our surveys. And then there's sort of obviously the question of country-level differences. Are these things going to really work across different contexts? And I'll get to this towards the end of the talk. So really quickly, in terms of the data and the methods. So this is based on 7 surveys that we did in countries that neighbor either Ukraine or Russia. So Poland, Hungary, Romania, Lithuania, and Kazakhstan were able to get about 1,000 respondents in each. Latvia and Azerbaijan, so we were doing these surveys with Pollfish, which has this random device engagement method. The idea being that they basically they place ads on a bunch of websites and apps, and people click on them and then decide whether they want to take our survey or not. And so in some of these smaller countries, particularly Latvia and in Azerbaijan, not so much because of its size, but because it's sort of relatively more remote, we just had a harder time filling the surveys, and we have separate results without these 2 countries. And the results actually get stronger if you get rid of them. And then, as far as the sort of main analytical approach here is that's the main thing that I'm going to show you is we at some point in the survey we give half of the people in each of the countries this experimental prompt, which basically says, take a minute to consider what life is like right now in Ukraine. How would you cope with the challenges of day-to-day life? what do you think would be the most challenging about being in Ukraine today? So notice there's no real information here. We're not telling them this many Ukrainians have died. We're not telling them this is how many air raid sirens they hear in a day. This is how much of the energy infrastructure has been killed. This is how many blackouts they have, and so on. All we say is, think for a second what it would be like to be there. And then, of course, these being online surveys, some people answer them relatively perfunctorily. Other people answer them seriously, and sometimes it's sort of, you read some of these things and it's kind of moving. We're going to show the effects on everybody, not just on the people who took us up, because obviously the people who don't take it up for a reason. And then basically what we're going to do is we're going to run. Yes, sorry.
Is that an open question, or do you give them?
No, it's an open question. So they write in their own stuff. It's the idea, and that's part of what the idea with these kinds of experiments is, to try to get people to activate their mind a little bit and sort of start thinking about it, because otherwise the temptation is to just click on something and move on. And so then what we do is we basically, it's a very straightforward experimental design where we have this treatment condition, the people who got this encouragement, and we regress the outcomes that we're interested in. I'm going to talk about them more in a second. On this treatment variable, we control for some demographics, so that's not necessarily, that's not 100% necessary. But we also control for previous connectedness to Ukrainian people and pro-Ukraine actions, which helps sort of narrow the sort of confidence intervals a little bit. So this is all pre-registered as it is. And then we do a series of causal mediation tests for empathy and the threat to the own country. So the two mechanisms that I was talking about. And we have all of these tests, partly because these are online surveys. We have these raking weights that try to get the populations to the sort of population parameters in terms of age, sex, education, and macro region. And then finally, we have these moderation tests, which basically are interactions between the treatment and some other variables that try to get at these questions of different types of, the extent to which these effects are stronger in some contexts than in others. In terms of the measures, our main outcomes are, and that are then the mechanisms that we're looking at is this pro-Ukraine feeling index. One of the questions is about whether they feel close to Ukrainians, whether they feel empathy for Ukrainians, and then there are questions about concerns for both civilian and military victims among the Ukrainians. And then on the question of concern for your own country, right? So the sort of cognitive aspect of it, we ask to what extent they're worried that about security threats to their country, about economic consequences, about Russia attacking their country, and then also about a nuclear conflict. And obviously, a nuclear conflict is not just against their country, but it's still a sense of being threatened yourself. And then in terms of the final outcomes, the so-called second-order outcomes, in a way, there's a set of personal actions that pro-Ukraine that somebody could take, such as writing a letter, contacting politicians, protesting in favor of Ukraine, donating or helping refugees. Right? So these are things that you as an individual can do. And then there are questions about support for humanitarian aid and for economic and military aid. And these are all indices that hang together pretty well. I know I won't bore you with the details unless you want to know more in the Q&A. Moderating variables that may make these effects weaker or stronger. We have a question that's pre-treatment about how close do you feel to the Ukrainian people, how close do you feel to the Russian people, and how close do you feel to your own people? I mean, to the people, whatever, it would be the Romanian people in Romania. I should say this, for the analysis on that, we exclude minorities, because, if a Hungarian doesn't feel particularly close to the Romanian people, the Romanians are not necessarily their in-group, so we don't want that to be sort of, to affect the results. We have questions about the frequency of media consumptions from Russian sources, both newspapers, radio, TV, and then whether they had personal contact with Ukrainian refugees. And then we have the controls that I've already talked about. Okay, so quickly before jumping into the actual results, I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of what these things look like. So here are just the country level averages. So these are simple, regressions with just using country dummies and the weights. So this is all rescaled on a scale from 0 to 1. 1 would be where you absolutely love the Ukrainian, you have absolute empathy with them, and so on, and 0 where you have none of that. And so what you see here is that as far as these averages go, people are just a little bit better than neutral on these. There are some cross-national differences. You can see on the right, Latvia and Lithuania are somewhat higher. Poland is a bit higher as well. Hungary seems to be, and Azerbaijan seem to be a little bit lower, but not drastic differences in terms of this. In terms of pro-Ukrainian individual actions, and I should say, so these are all based on just the control group. So just the people who did not get the empathy treatment, because we want to know, we don't want to sort of mix the baseline with the treatment effects. In terms of pro-Ukraine actions, not surprisingly, people do less. And here you see larger differences. Again, the Baltics tend to be on the higher side. Hungarians, surprisingly, Poles, relatively speaking, on the lower end of this. Again, these are all weighted averages. Of course, there may be, we can't get everybody in these online surveys and so on, but you can see a little bit more of the variation there. As far as the concerns for their own country, notice first that these levels are much higher than how concerned they are for Ukrainians and for others. So there's a certain sense of, caring about yourself. And, not surprisingly, these levels are quite high in Poland and in Latvia. Somewhat surprisingly, pretty high in Azerbaijan. Unclear whether this is because it was after that shooting down of that airplane or what it is. I mean, the Azeris have not had amazing relations with Russians, but if I had to put a list of the top 3 countries likely to be invaded, they would probably not be on it. But still, what we see are pretty high levels and at least some variations along the lines that we would expect. Hungarians don't worry as much, and I think probably rightly so. And then in terms of support for aid, again, relatively, in terms of humanitarian aid, just a little bit better for the most part than neutral, higher again in the Baltics. When moving to military and economic aid, as you can tell, the levels are generally lower, which is not surprising, right? Because there's sort of a sense in which, yes, we need to help these people because they suffer, but maybe they don't need military aid because they're just going to prolong the war, right? So there are certain narratives that, there are not many narratives that would say we should not help them humanitarily, but we should give them weapons. And what you see here is actually larger differences. Hungary is quite low. Kazakhstan is quite low. We have not looked very closely into this, but I suspect that it has something to do with what their respective governments are saying, as well as the media, right? Okay, so this is sort of the baseline, just to give you a little bit of a sense of where, from a substantive perspective, it might be interesting to know, but also to give you a sense of the political context in which we did this survey. And so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to sort of walk you through relatively quickly through the main results of our experiment. So in all of these surveys, well, most of the figures that I'm going to be showing you, we're going to basically show the effects, the difference between the group that got this empathy treatment and the control group. Right? So it basically tells us how much of an effect this exercise of putting yourself in the shoes of Ukrainian civilians has. And what you see here is that in terms of the pro-Ukrainian feelings, this sort of empathy index, it has a reasonably large and highly significant effect. So it makes people, in other words, our treatment seems to work. But it has no effect on worrying about your own country, which is the second one. Right, so just telling them put yourself in the shoes of Ukrainians doesn't make people more worried about their own country being invaded than otherwise. But we want to know whether which mechanism seems to work here. What we then see in terms of the sort of second order results and ultimately the outcomes that we care about maybe more, it does seem to lead to higher propensity to say that you want to do certain types of things in favor of Ukraine. Now, I should say these are just it's cheap talk in some sense, but there's a sort of willingness there. There's a marginally significant effect on humanitarian aid. And if you exclude Latvia and Azerbaijan, that becomes significant. And then as far as economic and military aid, the effect is marginally positive, but it's not close to being statistically significant. Again, if you exclude Azerbaijan and Latvia, the effect becomes at least marginally significant. So things are sort of in the right direction on aid, but they're definitely weaker than they are for the other ones, which again, in some sense is not that surprising, given that the types of considerations that go into aid are different than saying, yeah, I'm going to write a letter to an editor, or I feel warm towards Ukrainians. Really briefly, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but we did this mediation test. Obviously, there's no reason to do any mediation test for worrying about your own country because there's no effect at the first stage. But at the second stage, so the top estimates are the indirect effect via higher empathy for Ukrainians. And what you can see is that basically the entire effect on these outcomes is mediated through this empathy, right? So to the extent that that the treatment has an effect on this outcome, it goes through empathy, not through worry or something else. And now I'm going to talk about the different moderating factors. The first one being refugee contact. I should say this I did not show, but not surprisingly, there are pretty significant differences across countries in terms of the extent of refugee contact. So it's very high in the Baltics and in Poland, somewhat lower in Hungary and Romania, and then even lower in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan. If you look at the top, which is in this blue frame, we expected, if you remember, that we would see stronger effects for people who had refugee contact, right? So the idea is that if I met a refugee before, then sort of I should be more willing to engage in this sort of empathy response. And in fact, what we see is the opposite. We see stronger effects who had not met with a refugee before. And then not surprisingly, there's the rest of the effects are either weak or to the extent that they're again stronger for people who've had no refugee contact. So when we saw this, I mean, first of all, it was against what we were expecting and against what the literature suggests. And so what we did is to try to look at the sort of combination of the treatment and prior refugee contact. So what this shows in the case of pro-Ukraine feelings are the levels of pro-Ukraine feelings for people in the control group who either had or didn't have refugee contact, and then in the treatment group for both. And what you see, I mean, as before, the effect is larger for people who did not have the contact. But the reason why we see the effect there and not for the others is that, in a sense, if you already met a refugee, you've probably already gone through the process of sort of empathizing. And so what our treatment seems to do is it seems to compensate for those people who did not have this exposure. Now, what you can see is that the convergence is not complete, but it both for this and for pro-Ukraine actions, it seems to basically make up for about half the difference between people who had contact with refugees and others who didn't. In other words, for people who did not get the treatment, there's this difference, and it's not huge in substantive effects, but it's still there. So, and of course, having contact with refugees is endogenous itself, right? Because some people seek out refugees and others don't. But what is interesting is that this relatively modest treatment seems to account for about half the effect of having had contact with refugees before. So I think that's sort of an interesting and somewhat unexpected results. Then in terms of connections to Ukrainians, here the effects work the way we would have expected them to work. So on the top, you see in the blue frame, people who had before the treatment reported being closer to Ukrainians, they get moved more by the empathy treatment, whereas those who didn't still have an effect, but it's somewhat smaller. There's no effect, again, in terms of worrying about your own country. And then when it comes to some of these other outcomes, again, the effects are much stronger for the people who had these prior Ukrainian connections. In other words, at least on this end, it seems that the empathy treatment sort of makes the differences bigger. And partly because it seems that those who don't like the Ukrainians to begin with sort of resist more. Then moving to the other two outcomes, in terms of the connection to the in-group, remember that here what we had predicted is that if you have a stronger connection to your in-group, you would have a weaker response. And that is not what we're finding. What we are finding is, on the contrary, is that people who have a high in-group connection, i.e. Hungarians who say that they feel close to the Hungarian people, Romanians who say that they feel close to the Romanian people, they're the ones who are being pushed more by this, affected more by this treatment. And this is not a case of convergence, as we saw in the case of refugee contact. We don't know, to be honest, I don't know 100% what it is. It may be that, you know, if you're a Hungarian or Romanian and you say you have no connection to your own people, that there's some sort of a psychological thing that's going on with you that makes you're unable to empathize with anyone or have close connections. I don't know, and this is but it is interesting that it seems that a sort of, in some sense, healthy relationship to your own people seems to be the basis for being able to have healthy response, of empathetic response to others. And then in terms of connections to Russians, of course, it works the way you would expect it. People who have strongly connected to the Russian people do not have an empathetic response to Ukrainians. And people who, and remember, these are sort of, this holds not just for maybe Russian-speaking minorities, it holds even if you exclude them. Right? So this is a question of if you feel connection to the other side of the conflict, you're less likely to take this kind of empathetic response to the victims here. And then finally, I mean, here again, the differences are not that big for the rest of the outcomes, but at least as far as the empathetic response is concerned, we see this. And then in terms of media consumption, again, this time in line with our expectations, people who have regular Russian media consumption, defined as at least a few times a month, have a weak empathetic response. So the top outcome there is small and it's not statistically significant. People who either don't watch Russian media at all or very, very rarely have this response, right? And this makes sense from the point of view, given that most of the Russian media at this point, you know, you can't, certainly whatever gets published in Russia, you can't sort of go around saying that the Ukrainians are suffering and it would be nice to help them. And so from this perspective, that sort of framing of the narrative seems to matter. It's also worth noticing, which is sort of interesting, is that people who watch a lot of regular Russian media seem to also worry more about their own country than people who don't, right? So here we actually see differential responses, not just with respect to empathy, but with respect to threat as well. And then again, as expected, we see similar sort of patterns as far as actions and support for aid, right? So people who watch Russian media are not pushed in a direction of trying to help Ukraine more, whereas those who don't go in that direction. Okay, so now very briefly on country level heterogeneity, right? Because essentially, I mean, all of the results that I've shown you here have been pooled, but now we can run them separately by country. And what we see here is actually quite interesting in the sense that there are a number of countries. So this is on the empathetic response, right? So we see, yeah, get too excited about these things. Exactly. So from the top, Latvia, negative but insignificant. Lithuania, next, positive and significant. Kazakhstan, no effects. Azerbaijan, positive and significant. Romania, positive and marginally significant. Poland, positive, but nowhere near significant. And Hungary, significant as well. So I would be lying to you that I would have predicted that before. But trying to think through a little bit why this might be the case, One possibility is, at least for both for Poland and for Latvia, the relatively high degree of contact to refugees may explain why the effects are weaker for them. But of course, that doesn't explain why the Lithuanians have a strong positive effect. The strong effects in Hungary and possibly Azerbaijan, remember, there are some of the countries that had lower baseline support for some of these. So some of it could be just the fact that they had farther to go. But it could also be, and I don't know much about mass media in Azerbaijan, but I'm pretty sure that the largely Orban-dominated media in Hungary probably does not show a huge amount of stuff about the suffering of Ukrainians. And so in some sense, they were less treated before they got to think about this. Right? They're maybe perhaps less desensitized than some of the people elsewhere. Again, this is speculative, and we'd have to do much more systematic tests to try to get to this. The other option could be something about you know, the history of different countries with the relationship with Ukraine. But the fact that both Romania and Hungary, who have some sort of territorial claims against Ukraine, that doesn't seem to go in that direction. These are similar effects in the case of pro-Ukraine actions, right? So I'm not going to walk through this again. So quickly, in terms of the conclusions, because I want to leave time for Q&A, there's, as I've shown you, this empathy induction experiment does give us stronger support for both personal actions and for foreign aid to help Ukraine. We get strong mediation effects via empathy, but not via this sort of own threat perceptions. And then there's important heterogeneity. Both people who feel connected to Ukrainians and who feel connected to their own country seem to react more strongly to this sort of empathetic push. But then on the other hand, you get weaker effects for people who are either connected to the Russian people and or watch, sort of follow a lot more Russian mass media. And of course, those things are probably connected in ways that we cannot disentangle here. Obviously, when you do these kinds of things, there's a question of scope conditions. I've already shown you some of the internal scope conditions in terms of the differences across countries. And incidentally, I should have said, what's interesting is that the fact that the treatments did not work in Poland is actually in line with the null findings in the Czarnych et al. Piece. Right? So turns out that maybe the problem is not that they did anything wrong with their experiment, but that somehow Poles don't react in the same way. I don't want to, you know, psychologize at the level of entire peoples, but there is something. There are differences across countries in these responses, and I think those are sort of worth thinking about more. There is this an interesting and somewhat surprising finding about the fact that the connection between the contact to Ukrainian refugees, which means that given that most countries in the world have fewer Ukrainian refugees, fewer and less contact to Ukrainian refugees than Eastern Europe, we might expect stronger empathetic responses in other places. The other question that I touched upon a little bit in the Hungarian context is this question of the media environment. What kind of coverage of the war, how frequent, how is it framed, and so on. That would almost certainly create both certain types of priors and frames about how we interpret this suffering, right? I mean, yes, Ukrainians are suffering, but is it because of what the Russians are doing, or is it because their president is not willing to compromise and take a perfectly good peace deal from the American government, et cetera, right? I mean, there are different frames and different ways to cover it. And then there's, I think, an important temporal dimension, right? I would imagine that these tests would have, these kinds of interventions would have had a stronger effect early in the war. I think that after 3 years, there's a certain fatigue that sets in, and it's sort of harder. You know, the people who care already care. The people who you couldn't get to care are going to be much harder to reach. And so there's an interesting dimension here trying to think about how this would work. And then in terms of limitations and next steps, of course, one of the problems is that the effects that we have here are short term. We are now running a second wave, and we can theoretically test whether these interventions still matter 2 months later. To be honest, I'm not particularly optimistic about this because it's a relatively short-term intervention, but it's something that we can test. There's also a set of interesting questions about how prior experiences, both vis-a-vis Ukraine, certainly in the Polish case, but for some of the other neighboring countries as well, and vis-a-vis Russia, could affect these kinds of responses. And so we're actually currently running a second wave of these surveys where we're telling there's sort of two different treatments. One of them is talking about the Red Army taking over after World War II, and the other one is talking about people who say sort of along the lines of that ad, you know, you guys could be next type thing. And we want to see how that, we have a sense that that might work much more through these sort of threat perceptions and try to disentangle that. And then finally, I very much look forward to your suggestions, and thank you for.
Our division of responsibility is that I now handle the questions. Okay, that I now handle the questions, and I see you just casually signal. If you twitch, I may make you ask a question. So I see Dee Dee, and I see Alex, and I see what? Myself. Oh, and, okay. So since I'm holding the mic, and Marcel, okay, since I'm, oh, wow, okay.
Maybe I'll sit here so I can take notes.
Okay. Don't know you, lady at back. Okay, so as I am thinking about who to turn to next, I thought I would just slip in two questions of my own. One is the issue of the effect not being as strong in places or with people who've had experience with refugees. So you're assuming that their experience with refugees is positive, right? In your assumption, and it could be that it's actually negative, right? So I wanted to ask you about that. The Polish case, for example, it could be that people are resentful of the benefits that refugees get, and so the more contact with them, the more resentful they are, and therefore the treatment doesn't work. I don't know. I think you can answer that one more easily. Then the next one is, though, you only asked about exposure to Russian media. You didn't ask about exposure to Ukrainian media. And so I was in Georgia last year, and I was surprised that, and Georgia's not in your group of countries, but I was surprised that you could see Ukrainian media the entire time, just streaming constantly about the war. So I just wonder if that's the case in the Baltics, for example, too, or Poland, anywhere else. Okay, so those are my two questions, and I'll turn to Dee Dee next, but why don't you get those first?
Yeah. So good question about the Ukrainian media. Unfortunately we did not ask that, and in retrospect we probably should have. There's a fair bit of variation in the extent. So in Romania, you know, you can't. There's no. I mean, you could go online and try to, but there's no Ukrainian stations on TV and so on. Whereas the sort of Russian, and part of it is that most people in neighboring countries don't actually speak Ukrainian, whereas they're more certainly in the former Soviet republics who speak Russian. On the questions of negative experiences, I think that's a possibility. On the other hand, no, I no longer have it up here. The people who had refugee exposure had higher levels overall, right? So it's possible that some of them had negative experiences, but on balance, it's probably the other way around. But there's no question that there is some element of that, and you know, this is part of the discourse of some of the anti-Ukraine politicians who say, look, here are these guys, and they're coming and they're getting all of this stuff when we could be spending it on the poor people in Hungary, or not in Hungary because they're not doing it, but in Romania or Poland or whatever.
Okay, great. Okay, so here's who I have on my list: Dee Dee, Alex, Anna, Marcel, Hans, and then the lady at the back whose name I don't know. I'm sorry. Okay, Dee Dee.
Thank you so much. I was thinking that for this
and
finding,
if you can please introduce yourself.
I'm Dee Dee Kuo, a center
Grigore.
fellow at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. So for the finding you have that people with strong in-group identification then empathize more, it could be the case that they're better at thinking solidaristically or collectively, that they, like, if they can identify with a group, then they can identify with a group being victimized, potentially. But my question is, if you asked about salience, like, do you think that the Ukraine war is salient to you? I'd be interested in whether there are country level differences in whether people perceive that, it is more or less relevant to their lives.
Yeah. Okay. So we're doing. So that's an interesting thing about question about solidaristic thinking. I don't know that we have anything that's sort of specifically on that, but I do think. I mean, I think the thing that's sort of interesting to think here is like, what does it mean to say I am not connected to my own people? Right. So there's potentially, like I said, some sort of a psychological thing of like, I'm not connected to anyone, I'm alienated and so on. I may just be sort of unhappy with everything that's going on, and therefore I don't want to hear about Ukrainians either. But there could well be a sort of sense of, loving. In the paper we sort of say something, in order to love others you need to sort of love yourself first, perhaps. And obviously this is I don't want to get into that, but exactly. But then on the question of the salience of the war in Ukraine, we don't have a question directly that says how important is this war to you. I mean, a bunch of these questions about threats and so on arguably get at that, right? So if you're really worried about economic consequences or about Russia invading or whatever, and as you saw, these are quite high, even in the baseline, these things matter. Now, to what extent do these things then sort of translate into sort of different kinds of voting at the domestic level and so on? It tends in the Romanian case, I can speak to it, and it does. So the sort of respondents who are more pro-Russian, not surprisingly, vote more for the extreme right parties that are also tend to be, if not outright pro-Russian, then at least sort of much more lukewarm on Ukraine.
Okay, Alex.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. I think. Oh, sorry. I'm Alex. I'm a postdoc at CDDRL currently. But yeah, I mean, I think it would be interesting to know how those questions were framed, because I don't think I would necessarily say I feel that close to Canadians, and it's more of a like kind of anti-nationalist, left libertarian sort of. That you are, please. Yes. So I guess, yeah, I don't know exactly how those types of identities and survey questions operate in these contexts, but you might also have people that are sort of rejecting a kind of nationalist framework, and I don't know. But anyway, but the actual question I wanted to ask is, I'm curious about the choice to think about differences at the country level, and whether you're interested at all in kind of within country variation in terms of sort of geographic proximity to like borders and threat. So do we think that sort of Polish people as a whole react in a particular way, or are there differences between the Polish people that live closest to Ukraine and the Polish people that live closest to Germany? And yeah, of course, it seems like maybe the sample sizes are not like large enough to really explore that systematically in the study, but I was sort of curious what you think about that kind of within country variation in terms of sort of geographic proximity, especially as you move more into sort of threat concern as your framework.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think that's a very good question. The geographic granularity is not bad for these surveys. They actually do provide sort of the name of the town. So we could actually unfortunately, there have been some changes on the platform, so I'm not sure whether we have that for everybody, but we might be able. And I think, in Hungary, probably it doesn't matter quite as much. But if you're in Latvia or Lithuania and you're close to the border with Russia, you might see these things slightly differently. Same thing in Poland, potentially, and so on. So I think that's a good idea. Thanks. That's what we should be able to do.
Okay, Marcel.
Yes, I was trying to understand what support means in the context of the study.
Mm-hmm.
So I could imagine one kind of support being support for the people and their suffering, in which case you probably would want to support in a way that accelerates the peace process, and would also include the 20% of the population which are in territories conquered by Russia, which are not going to be affected by humanitarian aid that goes to the European state, or whether we sympathize with Ukrainian national ambitions in Croatia and so on, in which case you may say, oh, let's prolong the war until they win. So these are, to me, very different types of support. And I'm not even talking about support that says, let's keep the war running as long as possible so that keeps them off our back, keeps the Russians off our back.
Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely so we are trying to differentiate. So there are these questions. We looked actually separately at empathy for and sort of concern for Ukrainian civilians versus military, right? We do have questions about how much they like the Zelensky, for example, and then we have questions about support for different types of concessions, right? So theoretically, you could sort of say, I like the Ukrainian people, but they should just give the Russians Crimea and whatever other territories just so that Ukrainians stop dying, right? Now, in practice, the way it works is that the people who care about the Ukrainian people also tend to be less willing to support these kinds of the types of concessions that would make these kinds of territorial concessions permanent. And part of it is maybe that people don't think about it very deeply, and they just think we like the Ukrainians or we like the Russians. But you can obviously also tell a different story, which is that if you think of the Ukrainians who are stuck on the other side of the Russian, who are under Russian occupation, things are not good for them, right? And I think from that perspective, that kind of empathy would still potentially translate into saying, let's give them more money and more weapons so they can fight, even if that means more people dying. But I agree. It's the exact interpretation of this, and one could probably try to come up with sort of different typologies of support in that sense.
Okay, Anna.
Thank you. Thank you for a great talk. I had two short questions. One is about, if you could talk a bit more about the open-ended questions, and what did this treatment mean to them, right? Like, what were they offering as their own reasons? And the second question is about sort of the broader implications, either theoretical or political. How does this change? In some ways, how surprising is this? Right.
Yeah. So on the open-ended questions, that is something that I should have put it in the next steps. I think it would be interesting to see. To be honest, we looked more closely at the ones in Poland and in Romania, just because we were sort of, when we were running the pilots as well. And in Romania, mostly people just said things like, it must be awful, the sort of fear, the destruction, that this and that. In Poland, there was interesting because there were definitely some people who resisted the whole premise and sort of said, well, it's not that big of a deal unless you're exactly right on the front, type of things, right? And so there's so I think it would be interesting now, of course, doing these things. I mean, obviously we could run text models on Azeri, but that's, so some of those things are a little bit trickier, but I think that there is an interesting set of qualitative or semi-qualitative things that we could learn from this, maybe including about the sort of nature of the types of, what kinds of concerns are people talking about, and so on. In terms of the implications, and is this surprising? I mean, at a basic level, these kinds of things, if you tell people to put themselves in other people's shoes, they become more empathetic. Either it works or it doesn't work, and if it doesn't work, then you screwed something up, and if it works, then it's not that surprising. But I think where it is sort of interesting is in this sort of variation. Why do some people react and others not? And that holds both at the country level and at the individual level. So who can still be reached, right? And I think, again, I wish we had the foresight to ask these questions 3 years ago, to see how people responded back then. I mean, maybe back then everybody was empathetic, and therefore these kinds of things wouldn't have mattered. But this sort of notion of like, yes, it's easy to say this war has been going on forever. Come on, let's worry about other things, versus stopping for a second and saying, yes, let's think about what it is like. And so, again, I was not necessarily surprised, because otherwise we probably wouldn't have run this, but I was relieved that there is still a response to be gotten out of people. And again, online surveys are not necessarily the best way to reach people in terms of emotional response. So I would imagine that if you had this as a sort of bigger exercise, if you had focus groups and you started talking about, let's think about what it's like and so on, you might actually get noticeably stronger effects. What that then means downstream for policy implications and so on depends on, whether we think that democratic politicians listen to what people say on these things and what they care about.
Okay, Hans.
Yeah, super interesting. Thanks for sharing this with us. I have two questions. One is on the temporal. I'm Hans, Hoover Institution.
And he loves himself.
So two questions. The first one is on the temporal dimension that you mentioned at the end, which is also something that I've been I was thinking about throughout your talk, but in a different way than what you talked about, which you mentioned kind of the saturation of all these humanitarian arguments. But I was wondering if there's a temporal dimension to this idea of threat, that it's been years that the war has been going on. So in a way, this might be interpreted as a signal that Russia isn't as strong as we might think, because otherwise they would have conquered, invaded all of Ukraine, and it would be done years ago, right? Mm-hmm. So in a way, maybe reminding people that this war is still going on actually means that the aggressor isn't as threatening as we might think. And then my other question is, so I think you said that there's a follow-up study or something around 2, and I was wondering if you could include a question on kind of an economic dimension. There's agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine signed yesterday about getting economic resources from Ukraine, and I'm wondering if people might be swayed to give more support to Ukraine in exchange for access to rare earths or any other kind of things that you can get from Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you. So on the question of Russia not being as threatening, I mean, yes, in some sense, one of the things we learned from this is that the Russian military is not all that. On the other hand, if you remember the slide with the graph with the threats, most people were still pretty worried, right? And then in the context of the Trump administration's U-turn in terms of, should we or should we not defend these, we actually, I didn't have time for this, but we had the surveys in the field when the infamous Trump-Zelensky meeting took place. And what's interesting about that is that, so we can compare people just before and just after. And what's interesting there is that East Europeans came out liking Zelensky more and liking Trump less. That's not that surprising, but it's there in the data. There's not much of an effect on threats at that point, right? On the economic dimension, unfortunately, so we have a question of one of the items of sort of acceptable concessions is this, should they sign a mineral treatment with the U.S. What we are doing in these other surveys is looking more at we have a quote by Trump on Greenland, trying to sort of see how that affects both threat perceptions by some of these countries of if it's okay to just take stuff from other places, then maybe it's okay for the Russians to take Narva and so on. But then also the flip side of, well, then maybe it's okay for the Romanians and the Hungarians and the Poles to take a piece of, I mean, recently even the Moldovans want a piece of Ukraine, make Moldova great again, right? So there's sort of a sense in which by changing these kinds of norms, and then there's a tariff question, right? So on all of these, we potentially have different kinds of dynamics because suddenly the norms are different and so on. And in the meantime, for now, I think the mainstream discourse in Europe has held, but it has encouraged some of the people on the fringes.
Right, the lady at the back. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Hi, I am Kathryn, head of research at FY Georgia. Could you please elaborate a little bit on your case selection? Because I didn't see, for example, Estonia, Moldova, or Georgia. And I would be curious to see also the impact of we might be next kind of attitude in countries like Moldova and Georgia, which already have frozen conflicts in Russia. So just, I was wondering what was the logic behind this.
Thank you for that. Yeah, so we would have loved to do this in Georgia. Unfortunately, the polefish who we're using does not have a sample, the viable sample in Georgia, and so they would have been exactly completely technical issue. We did run it in Moldova, but the thing is, Moldova has also a very small sample, and so we did not include them in the pre-registration, and we only got about 400 respondents there, and then at that point, we didn't want to sort of throw them in with the others, partly because you don't know what to make out of a sample of 400 people and so on. Moldova, I mean, and again, Moldova is complicated because there's a frozen conflict. There's a relatively large sort of Russian-speaking population. Interestingly, some of the Ukrainians in Moldova are actually pretty pro-Russian as well. Right, so there's sort of complicated, but Moldova is included in the second wave, and so we're hoping to have more on that there. Same thing with Estonia. We would have loved to have Estonia. They just didn't have. I mean, Latvia barely has a sample. Estonia had even less. So it's purely for technical reasons. I think from a theoretical perspective, it would have been interesting.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Hi, I'm Grigore being here. Thank you so much for the talk. My question was partially answered. I wanted to ask you about these negotiations if you're planning to have this outcome in your next phase, maybe, because it feels like why this pro-Ukrainian feeling index doesn't translate into military actions because people just don't believe that military aid would help people suffer less, and that's why they maybe more inclined to.
Yeah, so I think that is a good question. So you can care about Ukraine in a number of different ways. Now, what I will say is that people who care about the Ukrainian people, right, who sort of say that they're close to Ukrainians, that they feel empathy to Ukrainians, and so on, they are still they are more in favor of including military aid. Right, what I'm showing you is just the indirect effects, right, and so that's and they are less willing to back the types of concessions along the lines of like, yeah, just give them the territories, have regime change in Kyiv and so on, and then the Ukrainians will stop dying. So it's not so in that sense those things are still aligned in the way that one would, but I think that there are probably people there who sort of have this empathetic response and sort of say, ultimately, maybe this is just not a viable strategy going forward, and we need to be looking at something else.
Okay, interesting. I share your name. Sorry.
Hi, Elizabeth Elder. I'm at the Grigore Institution. Thank you for this. I have a question about what exactly is being moved by the treatment, and this might be something that looking more at the open end could answer. I'm curious about whether the framing of the question as, what are the day-to-day challenges? How would you cope with, the things that are happening to Ukrainians in daily life? It prompts people to think about things that could be addressed through humanitarian aid. And so that, like, the reason there's the strongest effect on that outcome is because that's addressing the kind of stuff that's coming up when you think about the concerns in daily life, which is economic and military aid, or maybe getting at a separate set of questions, and that maybe perspective-taking treatment that targeted more of these kinds of things that could only be addressed through military threat rather than humanitarian aid could push the results in a different direction and maybe affect which outcomes are most moved.
Thanks. I think that's a good question. You're right that if we're having them think about daily lives of these people, I mean, again, you might think that if we give the Ukrainians more anti-aircraft stuff and so on, that might help the people on the ground be less affected by Russian missiles and so on. But you're right that there's a sort of more obvious link to humanitarian aid, and in a sense, in the paper we talk about this, we expect stronger effects on humanitarian than on military aid on this. So it's more we didn't even, I mean, maybe we should have, because we have the questions on concessions. We did not draw a sort of direct link to concessions, again, partly because you could make an argument for it in either direction, right? You could on the one hand say these poor Ukrainians, they should not have to lose even more, or you could say, well, if they just gave up some things, maybe they would be okay down the line. So the expectations are stronger for the things that are closer to this particular treatment. And that's partly why when we have this sort of separate set of experiments in the second wave, where we prime this sort of notion of military threat against your own country. There we might expect them to move less on the empathy side and more on the side of like, oh, geez, we need to give these guys more weapons. And so it'll be interesting to see whether the sort of interventions that move more in the directions of threat give you different kinds of responses, or whether it's just that military aid is such a fraud issue that because again, you can make an argument that if you give them even more, then the Russians are going to nuke, right, or whatever. So these things get much trickier. But I think you're right that it could be partly because.
Okay, great. Let's see, Michael.
I'm Michael. I'm a master's student in international policy. My question is sort of related to whether this is a question of fatigue, perhaps just fatalism. And if you were to ask people, do you think the war is even winnable? That would probably affect the dimension of their support militarily, but maybe they still have the kind of support. But I guess it's a question that matters because of the sort of narratives of victory that we're experiencing right now. Russia has 20% of the territory. They're saying that they've achieved their war aims, but I think if more people kind of push back on that, there would be perhaps a greater desire to continue supporting Ukraine. So I'm just wondering how that might factor into the survey, or if you have any.
Yeah. So we don't have a question about whether the war is winnable or not.
Who's winning in the,
So I mean, the thing that's sort of unclear with that is I don't know what I mean. I don't think that would be moved necessarily by something like an empathy treatment. It may be that if you sort of think a priori that the Ukrainians are losing this war, and the longer it goes on, the more they're gonna lose. It's just that there's also, frankly, it's unclear that any kind of peace treaty you would sign with Russia would be worth the paper that it's written on, right? So from that point of view, it's a little bit unclear. I mean, it's true that there are very difficult questions about, what is the long term? Yes, if we continue, I mean, short of hoping for some sort of regime change in Russia, a military solution to this is probably not in the cards, right? And then it sort of becomes this question of what you think about the sustainability, both economic and in terms of manpower on the Russian side, and what you think about the sustainability in terms of, again, manpower and drones and everything else on the Ukrainian side. And so that gets, and to be honest, I think these are important questions. I don't know that the average East European really thinks about this very deeply. So the worry is that if you ask these kinds of questions in a survey, you're not going to get particularly useful answers. So that's always the worry. I think that on the question of like, do I feel for Ukrainians or not, you can probably get reasonably informative answers. On these things that become much more technical, I think it's probably hard.
Dan Adelstein, French and Italian, and Grigore's former neighbor. So this is a lot of fun. And your neighbor now. So Grigore, I was wondering if there's any data or studies on the durability of these interventions. I could sort of see how, in the immediacy, like I've spent like a minute thinking about this, and I feel really pro-Ukrainian now. And then, I get a new TikTok video, and out of mind, and like the effect could be very short-lived. So I'm just curious about that aspect.
So the Donald Trump syndrome.
Right.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a fair question, and it's one that is sort of quite problematic for a lot of these kinds of interventions, right? I mean, this was a relatively weak intervention that works in the short term. Like I said, we may be able to, there should be a panel component to these surveys. So we might be able, in this new wave that is currently going on, we might be able to see whether having had that treatment 4 to 6 weeks ago will affect these things or not. The other way of answering this that's maybe a little less defeatist would be to say, well, this was a weak treatment and it worked. You probably need stronger and repeated treatments to make this sort of more of a right. So it could be whether it's things like focus groups or whether it's things like sort of more sustained types of. And again, here there are, I think, reasonable questions to be asked of how much of that would actually strengthen it versus then give you just a new kind of fatigue and a new kind of like, come on, stop manipulating me. I did it for you the first time, you're not going to jump again, right? So there's, which makes me wonder whether some of these cross-national differences that we see might also be that some people are like, we've heard this kind of arguments before, and ultimately there's only so much care that, we're willing to spread around. But yeah, if you wanted something even more depressing, here, you got it.
Yeah, one more question about one thing it does suggest too, though, is you could imagine Ukrainian media campaign, right? So when you give policy advice, you're within the country, perhaps the international community, but the Ukrainians could arguably put up posters and bus shelters saying, "Don't forget about us," and how we do. What was the
Yeah, and there's this goes way back for there's that image of the child in Somalia with a voucher and so on, right? So this sort of there are certain types of images and certain types of frames that can really stick. I mean, again, given the horrible things we've seen in this war, the sort of notion that people did not see those things, and maybe and that again, that's sort of in some sense, well, and it's so that's baked into the baseline, right? So but I think that thinking about what this does in a broader context for places that heard about the war at the beginning and then spent time worrying about lots of other things in between, going back to some of these places, whether it be in Latin America or in Africa or somewhere else, and sort of saying, by the way, this is what the life of a Ukrainian is like, that may actually sort of have more of an impact than in places like Poland or the Baltics, where they constantly see this stuff. Exactly. Yeah.
Lady in the back.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a visiting PhD student and pre-grad student at Princeton. Thinking about the last question, I had to step out for a second. I'm sorry someone asked something similar to this, but the last question, kind of the applications in the real world. This really makes me think of social media coming out of conflict settings. I think a lot of what you hear now from Gaza, for example, kind of people follow specific influencers and then they kind of get worried about them if they don't hear from them. And it is almost as if people know people, seeing into their life, into their lives, into their everyday routines. I think you kind of develop a sense of empathy. So I've been very curious, kind of as people feel like they have a connection to people in conflict settings. How is that sense of empathy affecting their views? But I'm just curious here how this relates to social media consumption. Kind of this is a big part of the social media diet. And maybe I think that can kind of be a way of implementing this at scale, and probably is already kind of happening organically at scale.
Yeah, thanks. That is a good question. We do have some general questions about news consumption from social media and so on. Of course, the problem is that we don't know what they're following, and there's actually a fair bit of heterogeneity on that. So, in Romania, the TikTokers are sort of mostly right, sort of far right, and influence the election in favor of candidates who are pro-Russian and anti-Ukrainian, right? In other places, this may be different. So you would need very different. I mean, one could theoretically collect, and this is sort of part of what I was talking about in terms of next steps. You could try to do a sentiment analysis both for TikTok messages related to the war and possibly to TV coverage and so on, and then see how those things differ. I mean, and the problem is that, of course, within countries, in Latvia and so on, I think that the consumption for Russian speakers compared to Latvian speakers is quite different. So it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. But I think that's true. Is that sort of seeing, and in some cases, in Ukraine, many of us who've studied this have sort of friends from before who you now follow on. Well, you used to follow them on X, now you follow them on Blue Sky or whatever, right? But sort of you see these kinds of messages and those stories, and they become a source of identification. What that does for people who had none of that content and just sort of stumbled across it in the context of this, I think is interesting. But yeah, that's a lot of data that we would need to get for that.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Grigore. Thank you, everyone in the audience. It's fascinating. And look forward to the next wave. We'll have.
Very happy.